Hi everyone, welcome to meeting number 20 of the M2D2 series. We are excited to have Minghao with us today to learn about how to generate new molecular data in few-shot or data efficient settings using graph grammar learning. A bit about Minghao before we start. Minghao is a first-year PhD student at MIT, supervised by Prof. Wujit Matuzik. He obtained his master's degree from the Chinese University of Hong Kong and bachelor degree from Tsinghua University. His research interest lies in the intersection of computer graphics and computational design, especially incorporating geometric learning and symbolic grammar with graph representation. Without further ado, the floor is yours.
Yeah, and thanks for the introduction. Many thanks for the chance for presenting my work at M2D2 here, and I really appreciate that. And today I would like to share our recent work on this data efficient graph grammar learning for molecular generation, and this is a joint work with folks from the IBM Research and the Watson AI Lab. And it's actually a published paper on this year's ICLR as an oral presentation. And for those who just attend this virtual conference, I would say that this talk is not just a copy of the previous video. So I have already prepared like more motivations with more technical details explained. And also for the second half of this presentation, I would also like to introduce a newly published paper of our recent progress of still like the grammar-based molecular generation. So let's start it. And the task of this molecule generation, as known by many of us, is that given a set of input existing molecules, we want to generate more molecular candidates, and usually like with more desirable properties. And at the core of this molecule generation is a generative model which cultivates like the underlying logics or like the distributions of how the molecules are generated based on the training data set. And the generative model takes like a descriptor of the molecules as input, like which we call a representation for the molecules. And this representation could be something like commonly used smell strings or some other fingerprints, like string-based representation, like the Morgan fingerprints. Or it can be some like latent vectors which are encoded using some like either manual design features or the trained machine learning models. And at the output side of this generative model, we also want like our generated sample to suit like certain chemical constraints, or at least like reveal some nice properties. For example, like we may want like the generated samples to cover the large possible chemical space, which in other words to be diverse enough. Or like we want our generated samples to be able to be synthesized like using the existing reactants or the reaction database. And here we show the general pipeline or the overall scheme of the molecule generation. And the input is a training data set, and we first convert them to a representation and then train a generative model that can generate novel molecule structures. And the molecule structures should be trained in a way that I would say like the generated model should be trained in a way that is generated samples can optimize some like domain specific metrics we concern like the diversity and the synthesizability we just mentioned. And recently there are like many state-of-the-art methods using the deep learning based generated models, including like the variational autoencoders, the GANs or the reinforcement learning. But there is a common drawback for this method, and it is that they usually like require large amounts of training data and typically like tens of thousands to achieve like kind of a reasonable performance. But however, in practice, the molecular data is not always abundant. So let's consider the case that where we want a kind of like specific type, molecular type to fulfill some ingredient requirements. So for example, we want to only generate a certain type of monomer for the polymer synthesis. So for example, we just want to generate the isocyanates to fabricate or synthesize the polyurethane. And some like real data set existing for a very recent paper on the polyurethane property prediction, and the real data set only consists of like 20 samples, and it is impossible to train or fine tune any deep learning based networks. And so to address this problem, we need to first kind of investigate why the deep learning based molecule generation like requires like huge data sets. And there's a common assumption in molecular generation is that the molecule structures contain like all the necessary information of the chemical knowledge. So for example, the valency restrictions or the sample quality. And we want our generative model to capture such kind of chemical knowledge based on like seeing as many as molecule structures as possible. And the way like how deep learning based generative model do this is kind of high level is to first take these molecule structures in the form of latent vectors as representation, which is achieved really achieved by some embedding function at I think it's really like some deep learning based neural networks. And then like the embedding function maps the samples from the training set here, and also the samples generated by the generative model. Like it can be anything like you just random sampling according to this latent distribution, or you have some like specific policy to help you how to generate the molecule, like the atom by atom, like the way like reinforcement does this. But essentially they just map these two kind of distribution. They map these training data sets or training samples to two different kind of distributions. And then like they want to capture the knowledge of the like the molecule structures based on some distribution learning techniques, like minimizing some like distance matrix between the distributions. That could be like KL divergence or and even some like optimal transport costs. And then like minimizing this distribution matrix and update the parameters of this embedding function. And the essential reason why like the deep learning based models require large amounts of data is that the latent vector is actually not a quite efficient representation. There are like several aspects to understand this kind of problem. So the first one is that the chemical space is extremely diverse and vast, and it is essentially a combinatorial structure space. And in order to make sure the generative model is learning from a reasonable distribution, one has to like have a really hard training data set and always increase the size of the training set to make sure that this embedded distribution is as close as the underlying distribution. And the more training samples we are given, and the smoother this distribution it is, and like the more accurate it is. And on the other hand, like even we provide a really large training data set, like many deep learning methods still struggle to learn very simple chemical constraints, such as the valency restrictions. And as shown in this very famous junction tree variation autoencounter paper for molecular generation, like many existing methods that cannot achieve 100% validity. Which in some sense is quite counterintuitive, because like it is super easy for some like hardworking chemical PhDs to just write down all the valency rules by hand, because essentially there are only like 118 elements existing in the world, and the valency constraints are something like quite simple to write down and further verify. So in summary, like an ideal representation should have like following properties. Like the first one is should be data efficient, meaning that I saw there was a question here, maybe.
I just want to ask, because previously you said we only have few samples. I want to ask, what's the performance of with just pre-training, for example, on a very large molecular data set, and then we yield for example a VAE model or a game model, then we fine tune on the few samples. This sounds reasonable. Yeah.
That's also something like most people do, like it's called like the few shot learning or some like transfer learning stuff, I think. But I think the problem is that the number of samples are really like sparse. Like I mean, the cases we are considering here is just like the number of samples just like around 20, or I mean, I think like at a reasonable performance as long as like I mean, at least like from our previous experience, you should have at least like maybe hundreds, or I mean like at least like over 100 samples. I think like 20 samples is just impossible. And another fact is that I mean, remember that our target is to generate only like one certain type of monomer. So for example, like we want to make sure that I think in these slides here, like we just want to synthesize or generate some like isocyanates with like desired functional groups. But if you learn some, if you like pre-train your network, like or your like version autoencoder on a really large data set that consists of all different kinds of like molecules, different types of molecules, I don't think it's easy for you to design an algorithm to make sure that this pre-trained distribution is specifically skewed or like biased towards one specific type. Yeah, I think like there should be some existing work on that. But like I think the case that we are considering here is kind of extreme, and so that is the reason why we want to develop this kind of grammar-based representation, which I will elaborate later. I'm not sure if this.
Okay, so you are trying to say that the reason that the pre-training fine-tuning paradigm didn't work here is that the samples is really few in this case. For example, if we have hundreds or thousands of samples, will this pre-training fine-tuning paradigm works?
Yeah, I think it will work like to some extent. I think at least like this is like a common practice in many different fields, and like but like another problem I mentioned that the target here, like we just want to generate a specific molecule type, and we need to have like fully control of this.
Yeah, I think for example, if you want a specific molecule type, you can for example, you can define a score for example for your wanted specific molecule type, you can define a score 1, and for you some molecule type you do not want, you can define a score, for example, as -1. Then you train a regression model on the latent space, and then you perform gradient ascent, something like this. How that what's the performance of this kind of method?
I think like I would say like I did not like perform any similar experiments before, but I would say it's definitely kind of possible solution to do this.
Okay, yeah.
But I'm still saying like I think the grammar we are trying to talk here still has some like advantage over the deep learning-based method, like like the explainability and like the detail efficiency is definitely one of the like advantage of the grammar, and some other benefits is essentially goes to the like the debates of the symbolic group AI or like the connectiveness, like so
oh yeah, as your point, so you are trying to say that
because this is requiring kind of more elaborate answer from the speaker, maybe we can let him finish and then we can come back to this question for the end of the talk.
Yeah, but like
we
have like 40 minutes I think in the end, so yeah, any questions that you can ask, I think. Okay, let me go back to where yes, I think I start from here. It's from here. Yeah, and like a hardworking chemical PhD can easily like write down all the rules and achieve like 100% validity. It was like really easy to verify. And like ideal like a representation should like have the kind of following properties. At the first, it should be like data efficient, and meaning that it can cover the vast chemical space with limited number of training samples provided, and second, like it should be expressive and can integrate the necessary chemical knowledge and constraints. Unfortunately, like people in the field of the formal grammar or formal language has already developed a kind of representation called this formal grammar and can suit these two constraints. And the formal grammar, like a formal grammar has with a like very small number of rules can actually generate a large amounts of samples. And the production rules can specifically define the necessary chemical constraints and is kind of expressive enough. And like in our case, like we use this formal grammar as the generative model for the molecules. And for those people who are not like quite familiar with this concept, like a formal grammar actually describes how to build a string from a language's alphabet using a set of production rules and given a set of terminal symbols and non-terminal symbols. And here, like we use this capital letter N as the set to denote the set of the terminal symbols, and all the terminal symbols are some capital letters. And we also use like this sigma to denote the non-terminal symbols. Like these are all the lower letters. And each production rule here has both the left-hand side and the right-hand side. And these rules essentially tells us like how to produce string in a kind of iterative manner. And here we show a very simple example using this grammar to generate a string, and from starting from this symbol S, and we iteratively select a sequence of rules to generate the strings. And in this example, like the first iteration is conducted by the rule number 1, and this initial symbol S is replaced by the substring, this A, B, S, C here. And at the next iteration, we select a production rule whose left-hand side like matches a non-terminal symbol inside the current string. And in this case, we select this capital letter S and like match it with the left-hand side of the rule number 2 and replace it with this substring, this ABC substring here. And this process continues for all the non-terminal symbols in the string until there is no other, it does not contain any non-terminals. And in this step, the rule number 3 is selected and it actually swap the position of this lower letter A and the capital letter B. And in the next iteration, like the only non-terminal symbol B is expanded using this rule number 4, and the production process ends since there's no non-terminal symbols or like capital letters in the current string. I think the interesting part of this formal grammar is that these production rules can actually be arranged in very different orders and resulting like in very different generated strings, as we show another example on the right here. And in this case, we have like in total like 8 production rules and to generate a string. And note that there's actually no restriction on the ordering of deploying the rules. And so like any combinations or the permutations of the rules is possible as long as the rule can find the matched left-hand side substring in the current string. And like in this case, like we have like 3, like we deploy the rule number 3 for 3 times, and it actually like move these 2 capital letter B's to the kind of the right position of this substring here, because like the rule number 3 just like swapping the position of the 2 letters, and we're trying to move the letter B to the right. And like this like more production step deployed to expand all the capital letters until there's no like non-terminal symbol inside the current string. And this actually shows the fact that like even with a small number of production rules, a grammar can still generate a large number of strings by just combining rules in different orders. And this is actually a combinatorial process and has an exponential number of possibly like generated strings. And in the case of the molecular generation as common practice, the molecules are represented as graphs, and where the atoms are represented as nodes and the bonds are represented as edges. And so instead of like using the string grammar as the generated model, we kind of deploy this called graph grammar, which is a more generalized version of the formal grammar. And in a graph grammar, that it consists of the like not the terminal symbols or the non-terminal symbols, it's just like the non-terminal nodes or terminal nodes. Like in this case, the non-terminal nodes, there are only 2 of them, like the X and R star, and the terminal nodes are like representing some like items. So like this is the carbon, this is the oxygen, this is the nitrogen. And for the production rules, both the left-hand side and the right-hand side are actually subgraphs instead of strings. And the subgraphs consist of the necessary edges, which represent the bonds, like the single bonds, double bonds, and the aromatic bonds. And the grammar generation based on a graph, the graph generation based on a graph grammar is kind of analogous to the one with the string-based grammar. So like still starting from the initial node X, we like the production rules are iteratively selected from the set whose like left-hand side can match a non-terminal subgraph of the current graph, and the matched subgraph is replaced using the right-hand side. Like in this case, we use the production rule number 1 to replace the initial symbol X with like a benzene-like ring, but has like 3 non-terminal R star here. And at the second step, this subgraph of these 2 R stars are selected, and these are matched with this production rule 4. And these white nodes here, like we call them anchor nodes in the paper. It just means that they can be matched, like be matched with like any arbitrary node in the original graph. And like you in this step, it also expand this subgraph to a benzene-like ring, but in this case, only 1 non-terminal symbol, and the anchor nodes actually tells you how to attach this subgraph to this original graph. And in this case, there are 2, like these 2 adjacent nodes are attached to the subgraph. and the process continues until there are no as long as like there are still like non-terminal nodes in the kernel graph. And in this step, like these two non-terminal nodes in the graph actually are both matched with the left-hand side of the production rule 3 and can be expanded like simultaneously by deploying this rule. And this process continues until like there are no non-terminal nodes inside the graph. And like the final generated graph can be converted to a kind of molecule, which in this case is diisocyanate called the NDI. And like by carefully designing the production rules, the generated graph can be converted to many different molecular structures. And such a graph grammar has, I think, several advantages, which like COTOWER needs for an ideal a molecular generation system. I'm not sure there's another question here or.
Yeah. So basically, in the previous example, the previous slide, you were showing this example when you finish the graph, then you generate the benzene ring out of the graph. And I was wondering if, here. So I was wondering if the grammar kind of account for the bond identity in some sort.
Oh yeah,
this seems to be the case, and so yeah.
Yeah, I think like it was integrating the rules of the grammar. Like I think I'm trying to use the different colors to distinguish different types of bonds. Like the red ones for the aromatic, and I think for the yellow ones are the double bonds, and like the gray ones for the single bonds. So these are kind of like built in the grammar, and this is like why it can suit the Wilson constraints, like because the bonds are all like encoded in the grammar, and each node here has its own meaning, like chemical meaning, like whether it corresponds to any type of the atoms, and like these are all like built in the grammar. Yeah, but this is like a simple case, but there are definitely like more complicated cases. Like, so you could like imagine like if you break the subgraph into really different pieces, and you will have a really like a fine detailed grammar and consists of many different rules, and it will essentially generate a really large possible set of molecules.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yes, so I mean the advantages of the grammar, we can use a small set of rules to generate large numbers of samples, and it suits the data efficiency constraint, and the generation process is totally explainable and understandable. And we can also like design production rules to integrate the necessary chemical constraints and knowledge, and making this grammar expressive. And actually, the use of the formal grammar has a quite long history across many different fields. Like one typical old but golden example is the procedural modeling in computer graphics, which is actually the background of my PhD supervisor. And so the procedural modeling in computer graphics has I think there's a subdirection called the L system that consists of a set of production rules that can generate plans. And these rules actually capture the bilateral symmetry of the leaves and also the rotation symmetry of the flowers. And the similar idea, like using the procedural modeling to generate buildings and cities, which is like also widely deployed for the game designs with interactive interfaces. And another related field is the computer vision, where like people use the grammars to understand the scene, and it could be like 2D scene images or like 3D models. And the grammar here serves as both a kind of generative model and also a structured way for us to pass like the scene composition, and further helps the understanding. And like even like in the field of chemistry, there are like several like recent works using the formal grammar in the context of the molecular generation. But however, like the common problem of this matter is that the grammar is actually manually designed by the human expert, and it is definitely tedious and relies on chemical expertise. And moreover, it is always kind of hard to design rules for really complicated constraints beyond the simple valency constraints. Like for example, what if we want to design a grammar that can generate samples that are only synthesizable? I mean, well, it may be possible to manually set some rules, like avoiding some unstable structures. But when the scope of the synthesizability goes really large, it is just impossible for a human expert to remember all these rules. And another example is that we want to like generate molecules that is extremely diverse. And how do we know and design in advance that one manually designed grammar has a higher diversity than the other? So in this project, we are trying to take advantage of the graph grammar representation, and at the same time tackle the common challenge of existing works. So like given an input of a small training data set, and the output of our method is a grammar-based generative model, and which can generate normal structures by grammar production. And such a model is automatically learned from the input, like getting rid of like tedious manual design process. And we achieve this by proposing a method called the bottom-up graph grammar construction. This is actually a very similar concept from the program synthesis, like given input of sample examples and you want to synthesize a program, and you can deal with this problem in a bottom-up search way or a top-down way, or like even more stochastic ways. But in our problem, we just deploy this bottom-up construction, and the input is a set of molecules, and also like we need to fix the set of the non-terminal symbols and the terminal symbols. And the goal of the bottom-up construction is to construct a set of production rules from these inputs. And the molecules are actually first converted into graphs, and such a graph consists of like edges which can join like two adjacent nodes or like an individual ring. So in this case, like this E1 to E3 or this E6 to E8, like they only join two adjacent nodes, and this E4 and E5 actually join the individual ring. And we construct a grammar by a process like iteratively sampling a set of edges and progressively contracting them. And for each contraction step, a production rule is constructed and added to the grammar, and we simultaneously perform this edge selection and rule construction process for all the input molecules until like all the graphs become single nodes. And specifically, like at each step, we select the edges either based on some certain rules or random sampling, and the selected edges can form a kind of subgraph, which can be contracted into a non-terminal node. And the production rule can be constructed at each contraction step. Like in this case, like the right-hand side, the left-hand side is actually the replace the non-terminal symbol, and the right-hand side is the contracted subgraph. And like when it is possible, like we can select multiple edges for one certain iteration, and when it happens, we contract all the connected components and construct a rule for each component. As shown in this step here, the left-hand side of the constructed grammar, the constructed rule is still like the replaced non-terminal symbol, but the right-hand side is the connected subcomponent by the selected edges, which consider these three nodes here. And like such a process that continues until the graph only consists of one single non-terminal node. And for this finally constructed rule, we use the initial node X instead of the R for the left-hand side of the rule. And the whole construction continues for those graphs that are still like has some non-terminal. There's still like there is not for those graphs that are not single nodes. Like yeah, and until like the final step is like you collapse all the graphs into a single node. And like an immediate issue of this bottom-up construction is that there actually exist multiple sequences of selecting the edges, and which will essentially give us like multiple constraint grammar. And the remaining problem is how to choose the best grammar. And our intuition here is that the best grammar should capture the necessary information for both the inter-similarity and the intersimilarity at different scales, which goes to the second part of our method. Important observation is that the constructed grammar using the bottom-up method is determined by the sequence of edge sets selected. So this means that if we have a rank on each edge, like telling us whether it is being collapsed, then we can actually deterministically obtain this grammar. So like the ordering or like the ranking of the edges can actually be achieved using the construction of a minimum spanning tree. And as long as we perform a minimum spanning tree algorithm simultaneously on all the input graphs, we can get an order of all the selecting edges, which in turn give us a grammar. Yeah, I saw a question here.
Yes. So all the rules that are generated, do they have the same importance? I can imagine that.
They have the same what? The same.
Some importance.
Oh, importance. Oh,
are they equally important? Okay, I can imagine if we are generating this grammar for molecule that that possess a certain activity, and then we kind of add some rule that are only given by only one molecule, then we might be at the risk of overfitting the training process. So just want to know how you kind of avoid overfitting during learning of this grammar.
Oh, I think as actually, let me think, the overfitting of the grammar. I'm not sure it's actually a problem of this kind of approach. Yeah, definitely, like we assign importance to the edges. If you go to the next slide, like we discussed about the minimum span tree, we will essentially like assign like an edge weight function to each of the edge, and you can treat this function as kind of importance irrelevant. I mean, the algorithm is that, or the point is that the function is actually learned. Like I will describe it later in more details. And so it is kind of like you can like optimize this function with respect to any objective, like the diversity and the synthesizability we are considering in the original paper. And definitely you can set more different metrics for the grammar or for the generated samples. So yeah, so I don't see like there's a really essential overfitting problem here, because the function, the attribute function is kind of a generalized one, I think. But I will like explain in details. I'm not sure after I explain all the like the following part of this algorithm, I can solve this problem, solve your question. So.
Okay, thank you. There's one more question from Kate in the chat.
Oh yeah, sure. I think it's on the chat, or oh, it's in the chat. Okay.
Yeah, I can say it out loud if it's easier. So I was just asking that, can we have several like rules that are starting from symbol X on the left-hand side, like starting symbol? And if so, how do we select like some of them on the sampling time? So how does it work?
You mean like you have multiple starting rules, right, in your grammar? Yes. I think you have like multiple ways actually. I have tried both. So the first one is you just pick one starting rule, like because the generation process is kind of random. You can like random do this, or you just like do a kind of like I think the bright first the search tree, like you expand a really large grammar from the initial symbol, and you can form a kind of tree, and this tree, the root is the I think the initial symbol X, and at each branch, at each level of this tree, and you have many branches, and these branches are these branches correspond to the rules of your original grammar, like can be deployed for the parent node. So you can like do some like EFS search tree and to do this problem. So essentially, like if you like random sampling your grammar, or random sampling to generate your molecules, you are just like sampling around this kind of tree. And so in that case, you just I think you just like randomly pick one single starting rule at the beginning. Or it is possible that you have multiple, like you deploy all the rules, all the starting rules at the same time, and this will like create some really weird I think structures in the end of the production process. Like for example, if you have a certain rule that can help you to connect two subgraphs, so that so at the beginning, like you have like two starting nodes, and like you expand them to two subgraphs, and at a certain point of the production process, a rule will try to connect these two subgraphs, and will like create a really huge structure. But in the original paper, we just thought of the first one, like we are kind of assuming this during the production process, there is only one starting rule is picked up. Like we are now trying to like simultaneously expand.
Okay, I see. But the grammar itself has several starting rules.
Yeah, it is possible. It is possible. And actually the learned grammar of our algorithm indeed has multiple starting rules. Yeah.
Yeah, I see. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, so as we had just discussed, like I mean, essentially, like we want to automatically learn this grammar. So and we know like I think the bottom up construction is actually determined by the sequence of the collapsed edges, or the like how you pick the edges at each iteration. So essentially, you are trying to assign a rank for each edge. and tells us like whether it is being collapsed. And this kind of ranking scheme can be achieved using a minimum spanning tree. And as long as like we perform a minimum spanning tree algorithm and simultaneously on all the input graphs, which will give you a minimum spanning forest, and we can still get an order of all the selecting edges, which in turn gives us a grammar. So like minimum spanning tree needs a parameterized edge weight function, which in this case we call the f theta e here, and E is the edge and theta is the parameter we want to learn, and the FE theta actually determines the constructed grammar. And to get the best performing grammar, we construct an optimization problem with respect to the parameter theta in the edge weight function. And in our case, we define the objective at the diversity and the validity. And actually, this validity is not just the validity constraint; it's just like it's actually I think the synthesizability of a molecule generated by the grammar. And note that these two metrics, they are originally like taking the molecule samples as input, but when we're trying to define this formula here, these two functions are taking the grammar as input, which when you actually evaluating this function, you should use this grammar to generate like a bunch of samples or I mean a complete set of samples, and then evaluate the all these generated samples with respect to these metrics. Like these essentially they are optimizing the grammar, which will in turn optimize the theta of the edge weight function, and the lambda is just a balance factor for the two objectives. And like to perform this kind of algorithm, optimization algorithm, we need to calculate gradient of the matrix to the parameter theta, which is unfortunately non-differentiable because minimum spanning tree is a combinatorial optimization. So we just tackle this problem by treating the optimization as an inference problem, like the I mean, we treat the edge selection process not as deterministic, but random. So we assign each edge a random variable following the Bernoulli distribution parameterized by this edge weight function. And the probability, yeah, it's just a sigmoid function. And the objective is also turned to be the maximization of an expectation. And then the gradient it can be approximated using the Monte Carlo sampling and the reinforced trig. And just like some details here, I think I could skip it really fast, but so it's just like a rigorous formulation and derivations. Like so we define the random variable on each edge, which for each edge which follows Bernoulli distribution, and this is a sigmoid function of the negative value of the edge weight function and this edge weight function is actually just a two linear MLP, and but this MLP takes a feature vector of this edge as input. And we extract this feature use a pre-trained graph neural networks, and it actually can be replaced by any other feature extractors. And I think we have previously tried like some manual design features, like the number of nodes or some like statistics on the graphs, and it actually works pretty well, but not as good as this graph neural network. So and the overall optimization process, this MLP is learned. And now this graph neural network is actually fixed because it's just like we just use it as a kind of feature extractor. And like based on this kind of random variable, we can define the probability of this grammar, which we treat the same distribution as like sample all the edges in a kind of IID manner. Like the probability of the grammar are just the multiplication of all the edges, all the multiplications of the properties of all the edges on the graph. And the optimization objective is the expectation of the weighted matrix we concern, and the lambda is weight, m is the metric evaluation function, and it could be the diversity or the synthesizability. And the gradient calculation, we use the trick of the score function estimator, or we call it reinforce, which will convert the gradient of the expectation to the average of the gradients of the sample scores, and the scores are actually calculated using the log probability multiplies the metric values. And here we show some experiment results, and we evaluate the overall algorithm actually across several data sets. Like first, we, as we said before, like our target is to generate some class-specific monomers or polymers, and we curate some class-specific data sets, and like each of them consists of only around 20 training samples. Yeah, this fulfill the target of the ingredient requirement. And also we test our method on a commonly used large polymer benchmark, which is, I think, this is the most commonly used benchmark for the molecular generation, which consists of like around 81,000 samples. In some like quality results, like we visualize the production rules of some of the production rules of the learned grammar, and also some samples generated by the grammar. And actually an interesting observation is that our grammar can discover the functional groups. I think here is the functional group of the isocyanates. This is for the polymers, and this is for the chain extender thing. And so like this actually shows that, I mean, the grammar combines some minimal structural features from the input. Like we do not like explicitly define the objective as the discovering some functional groups, but the grammar indeed can represent some kind of features like that. And the results show like our method is effective on the on these like class-specific polymer data sets, especially considering the domain-specific metrics, which is the diversity, and this is the synthesizability, or we call the validity, in the optimization objective. And also like this is our target. We want to calculate the number, the percentage of molecules that belonging to the concerned class. So they're indeed like our methods can outperform all these others. And it also, I mean, for some other like common use metrics, the learned graph grammar also shows some competitive results. And on large polymer data set, like our method only use like 0.15% of original data set. Like we only train on like 111 and 17 like samples of the original data set. And these samples are just kind of random picked up. There's like no specific cherry picking or anything about it here, but and all the like the sample quality or the distribution statistics, we show relatively competitive results and demonstrate like the data efficiency of the learned grammar. And also like the method can not just only construct one single grammar, but also extract like multiple grammars. So you could just vary the balance factor between the validity and this diversity, and you can find like a set of grammar lying on the Pareto front of this diversity and the synthesizability trade-off. So we just discussed like the grammar-based generation for relatively small molecules, or we say like mainly targeting on the monomers. And the next question is like how to scale up to the polymers. And there are actually several, I mean, essential challenges for a design model of polymers, especially compared with the small molecules. And the most important one is like the complicated and stochastic nature of the polymer structures. So here we show an example of the polyurethane. Like consider this polyurethane synthesized by 3 different kinds of monomers, and like 2 MDIs and this one PTMO, and this will give you like 3 different possible structures. And if you just increase the number of the components and the number of the possible structures, that increase exponentially due to the component permutation and the combination. And this like a vast set of the structures, and makes it like really challenging to design a kind of a complete polymer representation. And naturally we use this formal grammar to as the complete chemical design model for polymers. And it is like a parametric context sensitive grammar, which we add 2 more features for this grammar. And it's based on kind of the hypergraph based symbolic representation. And this PolyGrammar only consists of only 14 rules and can generate like all valid polymer structures within the given class. And we further validated this power on like more than 600 polyurethane samples from the literature. And this is actually an extension of the previous academic work, and is published as a journal paper on the One Science. So here we show the schematic of the PolyGrammar, and the PolyGrammar represent the polymer chain structure as a hypergraph, and each hypergraph is then represented as a string of symbols. And based on this representation, like we introduce a set of production rules, which is a generative model that can effectively like generate chemically valid symbolic strings and converted them to a polymer chains. And like we further propose like kind of inverse process that translates polymer's smell string into the sequence of the production rules used to generate it. And so starting from the first part, the hypergraph-based symbolic representation, and so it's kind of a common practice to treat the molecule as the graphs, but for the polymers, there are just like too many nodes. So we just use hypergraphs that has many like hyper edges that can connect more than one node. And this hypergraph implementation could be formed in a more concise way, like you just shrink down the hyper edges to a one single node. It's also called, I think it's called a kind of dual graph of the original hypergraph, but it's a kind of representation that's really simple, like just two nodes connect to one single line. And like the typical polyrhythmic structure, here we show an example for it. And so like typical polyrhythmic has some hard segments, the soft segments, and also the chain extender. And like we can convert this typical structure into a hypergraph representation. And in this case, it's just a kind of a linear, or it's a chain structure. And actually, this representation is capable for all structures of polymers, including like the linear structures and the branch structures. And given this hypergraph representation, we can just convert each hyper edge to I think to a letter or to a symbol, and you can like for these two examples, like this linear structure converted to a string of symbols, and for the branch structures you could add some brackets. This is kind of like similar to the smells representation, but still like it is based on the hypergraph, not on the like basic items. And like based on this representation, we derive a generative model, which in this case we just use a string-based grammar, as we have previously discussed. It consists of these non-terminal symbols and terminal symbols. And so like a very simple example is like this, like there are only 4 production rules, and you can generate like this HHS here. And if you can replace these nodes with some corresponding monomers, you can get the polyurethane chain. But the problem of this naive formal grammar is that it can only generate molecules along one single direction. So this is not like, it is not imitating the real like generation process of polyurethane, that it can grow 2 directions. So that is why we introduce this context-sensitive grammar, that not only at the left-hand side, you should consider the context surrounding each of this non-terminal symbol. And here is an example of the context-sensitive grammar that with these only 14 rules, you can just like iteratively expand the non-terminal symbols in the kernel string. But at each step, you need to consider context surrounding them, and you should match them with the rules inside this context grammar. And again, this example gives you like a polyurethane chain here. And like the third feature, or the second feature we are trying to consider is how to add some controllable parameters. Like for example, we only want to generate polyurethane chains that has certain chain length. And this gives you the parametric grammar, which you will augment each of these terminal symbol with a parameter. And like this is the initial parameter for the grammar. And for each of this rule, you have some like parameters and some formula to tell you under which conditions this production rule can be employed or not. And this is the example for the parametric grammar. We just augment the previous context-sensitive grammar with the parameter and the conditions. And so by varying the initial value of this edge length, you could generate like polymer chains with different lengths. And here are some examples of this in total parametric context-sensitive grammar. These are some generated strings and generated samples. And there are like more complicated samples, and because essentially it's just a combinatorial search, so with like 14 production rules, you can generate more than 2 million structures. And there are also some advanced features in the paper, like we create some extensions for the branched polyurethane, and also add more controllable parameters like the ratio between the hard segment to the soft segment and the molecular weights. And this will include some like more complicated schemes of the grammar, like you have a messenger tells you, like the kind of messenger like transfer between the two ends of the string, and tells you like carrying some kind of necessary information and tells you how to expand the string. And like more details, you could like, I think you're welcome to read the paper. And also to demonstrate the completeness of this polygrammar, we introduced this component called the translation from smells. And it's just like decompose the smell strings into some of the subgraphs, and like you define some of the search algorithm and identifying algorithm, and match with the rule set of the original graph, of the original smell string. So this essentially tells us because smell strings is a complete representation. So if you can convert every smell string to the a sequence of production rules, this is actually telling you this polygram is actually a complete representation. And we perform this algorithm on the dataset collected from literature, and it shows the PolyGrammar has really high representative capacity. So yeah, I think that's the mainly part of the two papers, and there are actually many more exciting future works. And the first immediate one is that to use this grammar-based representation for the property prediction. It has shown in the task of the molecule generation that the grammar is data efficient. So it will be really interesting to see that whether the same advantage can be maintained for the property prediction, and it could be really powerful in conjunction with some existing methods like the graph neural networks, and to get the synthesis of the polymers and facilitate some complicated tasks like the molecular discovery and the property optimization. And the second work is that the grammar is also kind of helpful for the reverse engineer of the polymer design, the production, or we call it retrosynthesis. And in the actual paper, we have already used the RetroStar, which is I think it's the SML paper, the specific target on the retrosynthesis. But I think the grammar can actually reveal some very nice, I think, synthesis process or some reactions. So it will be really interesting to see whether the automatically learned grammar, it has some rules, just directly corresponds to some reactions, or it can maybe discover some new reactions between the subcomponents of the molecule. And also that this grammar is actually a kind of generalized representation, and ideally it can be deployed for any general graphs beyond chemistry, like the 3D meshes, or even the social networks, or even the robotic designs. And this is a summary of the whole of my talk. We propose a data efficient generative model for molecular generation, and this model is in the form of graph grammar and can be automatically learned from the training data. And an optimization framework is proposed to construct the grammar with respect to various chemical metrics, and we further propose a context sensitive parametric grammar for the polymers. And that is all of my talk. So welcome to check out our code. I'm sorry, I think we only have 5 minutes left because, but yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions on the Slack channel or in any format or email or anything.
Thank you so much, Minghao. Yeah, was fascinating. I can kick off with the first question. So one thing that I'm thinking about is now the grammar has been learned only based on positive example. What happens if you have negative example? So for example, we want some molecule that are active, then we have 20 of those, but we also have 1,000 or 100 of other molecules that we know that are not active. Do you see any way of using this same process to actually not generate what's not active?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure, but maybe I think it's not a good idea, but you just collect all the negative samples and then train a grammar, and you say all the production rules produced by this grammar is false or is negative. That could be a possible way, but I think what I'm trying to talk about is actually I think the classification of something, or you so for now the grammar, you need to know in advance that what is valid or what is invalid, or at least we are only collecting samples from the literature, and the literature samples are, I think, I trust the chemical people, and they should be valid, or they should be positive samples. So maybe I think a possible way to do this is based on this grammar representation, you have another classification model. Either it could be a deep learning network, or it could be any other machine learning based methods. So actually, this is something I'm trying to investigate these days. Like, I'm still trying to treat a grammar representation as a kind of intrinsic representation of the relationship between the molecules. Because as long as you have a grammar, and this grammar can like generate tons of samples, because I think it can be infinite number of samples, because you can always attach a subgraph to the like basic graph. So I mean, if you have a like kind of a tree of this grammar, it will tells you like the intrinsic relationship between the molecular nodes or the different molecules, and this is actually very interesting, like connected to some like geometry learning, because I mean I know like the recent trend in graph neural networks, they are trying to treat the graph itself in a kind of a geometric way. And the grammar is actually providing a kind of intrinsic geometry representation. Like any property prediction value is trying to predict the extrinsic geometry, but the grammar is an intrinsic geometry. I think it could be like really helpful for all the tasks, like including the classification tasks you are mentioning, and also some like regression tasks. So yeah, that is my like trying to like investigate along this direction. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Boris has a question. Boris, do you want to ask a question? Okay, you can talk. So
I can.
The question is basically how the diversity and the validity is controlled. Trade-off, the trade-off plot shown earlier.
Actually, we just like have a balance factor in the objective function. It's not like in fully controlled way, but just like the trade-off part is just by varying the values of the balance factor in the objective function. So I don't think it's just like a temporary solution for the fully control of these two objectives. But for now, I don't like figure out a really clean way to tell you like how it was fully controlled. Maybe because like the optimization framework we are trying to use is really simple. Like we just use the really naive score function estimator. Maybe you switch to more advanced versions, like some marker random field or something like that. You can have like more control of the parameters on each edge or on each production rule, and then you can have like more advanced version for the control of the objectives. Yeah. I think that's an open problem, I think. So